Thank you, Rebecca Solnit and John King, and all of you for engaging in this important and indeed critical conversation. Special thanks and welcome to the San Francisco Chronicle, which has provided funding to enable the event tonight, our relaunched Herb Caen Lecture Series. I would like to welcome and introduce Bill Nagel, the publisher of the San Francisco Chronicle, who has invigorated and shepherded our storied Bay Area newspaper into the digital age at a time of great upheaval in the newspaper industry. Thank you for your partnership, Bill.
Thank you, Dean Anand. It's such a pleasure to be here tonight. Herb Caen, as most of you know, was a San Francisco legend. He started writing his items column in 1938, and it was really kind of at the time known as this spicy blend of humor, celebrity, a little bit of gossip, and he, for most of that time, he wrote for some 50 years at the Chronicle, with a little stint for about 8 years at the rival Examiner, which ironically was owned by the Hearst Corporation at that time, or by WR. But his writing style was a three typographical device. It was a three-dotted typographical device. And people today compare that to tweets. And the reality was that he did these columns, and he wrote 6 times a week, which is today unheard of. But he would write these columns, and he did it on a manual typewriter. And this is well after the entire newsroom had gone to computers. So he was still typing away on that manual typewriter. And he joked that he would really never win a Pulitzer Prize because that was for deep, serious journalism, and that's something he was not. But he was a serious scoop seeker, and so his ideal column would be 24 short stories or short quips that were about a week ahead of the rest of the city desk. And even at age 75, he said, at deadline, I still get butterflies, wondering if I can get away with it one more time. He was kind of the ultimate fake it till you make it guy. And when he died at age 80 in 1997, President Clinton was one of those who gave his condolences. And Mayor Willie Brown, who turns 90 this week, had the city flag at half staff. But he was awarded in 1996 a special Pulitzer Prize, much to his surprise, for his extraordinary and continuing contribution to the city, and he became kind of the voice and conscience of San Francisco. So much so that he was named, there was a Herb Caen Way was named as part of the Embarcadero and still is there today. Now, why we're here tonight, the lecture series. So this started in 1996, shortly before Herb's passing. And it was started as a funding with Chronicle Publishing Company along with the Getty Foundation, among others. And the first of that series, it featured Walter Cronkite. And since that time, there were Dan Rather, Tom Brokaw, Helen Thomas, Peter Coyote, and even Studs Terkel. So then the lecture series went on hiatus for some period of a decade. I just want to give my thanks to the team from the Chronicle, including Mike Gray, and from the Berkeley School for bringing this series back to life. And so I'm pleased that you're here tonight for the relaunch of the series. And with that, I want to introduce Jason Spingarn-Koff, who's now the professor and Knight Chair of Climate Journalism at UC Berkeley's School of Journalism. Jason?
Thank you, Dean Anand and Bill. My name is Jason Spingarn-Koff, and I have the honor of being the Knight Chair in Climate Journalism at UC Berkeley. And I'm an alum of Berkeley Journalism, and I came back here after 7 years as the director of original documentary programming at Netflix, where I had the chance to work on documentaries that have changed our perspectives on the natural world, including the film My Octopus Teacher. And I came back because I believe in the extraordinary depth of knowledge and expertise across science, technology, sustainability, biodiversity, resource equity, and social justice that we can and must shift our narratives from despair, which breed inaction, to a sense of hope and possibility, which can inspire action for change. And tonight we're going to probe these narratives. To do so, I'm so honored to introduce San Francisco urban design critic John King, a two-time finalist for the Pulitzer Prize and a true newspaper man, who's been at the SF Chronicle for more than 30 years. He too is a Cal Bear, who completed his undergraduate degree at Berkeley before moving east, where he had a 3-year stint at the Boston Globe. King is the author of Cityscapes and Cityscapes 2, Reading the Architecture of San Francisco, which include his insights on 50 global buildings and his original photographs. He recently wrote Portal, San Francisco's ferry building and the reinvention of American cities. King's reporting has quite simply shaped our understanding of the urban landscape in the Bay Area. We're so pleased that he'll interview author, historian, and activist Rebecca Solnit, who we know needs little introduction in this room. And Solnit is the author of more than 20 books that span feminism and social change, walking, and mansplaining. She's a regular contributor to the Guardian newspaper. She serves on the board of the climate group Oil Change International, and she recently launched the climate project Not Too Late. She also is now on Third Act's board of, she's on the Third Act's board, and also on Dayenu, a Jewish Voice for Climate's advisory board. Solnit recently edited Not Too Late, Changing the Climate Story from Despair to Possibility. Her essay, the first in the book, is entitled Difficult is Not the Same as Impossible. A favorite quote of mine from Solnit, which I've quoted to my students, some of them are here, is hope is not like a lottery ticket that you can sit on the sofa and clutch. Hope is an axe you break down doors with in an emergency. Yeah. Welcome, Rebecca and John.
There is so much we could talk about, but I want to get started with the book Not Too Late that you edited with Thelma Young, Latuna Tabua. And I don't know how many of you have looked at the book. It's a fascinating collection that looks at climate change not from top-down scientific studies, though authors of big scientific studies have essays in it, but really from all different cultures, all different geographic spots in the world, and all different scales of experience. But where I wanted to start is in the acknowledgments. The first acknowledgement that Rebecca wrote is to Thelma, who she co-edited the book with. But then my second go to a wonderful gathering of old and new friends in March 2022. When I told them I'd stopped writing books to try to be a better climate activist and told them about Not Too Late, which is an online presence and source of information, they, in unison, told me to turn it into a book, so we did. And so that's what I'm kind of curious about is, so you tell friends, I'm going to set writing aside for a bit, I need to focus on the climate, and they say, you should do a book about that. What was your reaction at the moment, and how did it become a book?
I think I was having one of those rare, terrible Protestant moments when I thought somehow being sort of repressive and sacrificial was what I should be doing. Writing comes easily to me. other forms of being an organizer, being out doing other kinds of activism, less so. And I'd really been waiting for a long time for somebody to tell me what my job in the climate movement was. And I was around 350.org when it was founded, and I've known Bill McKibben so long that I remember Bill saying, I think I'm going to become an activist. How do you do that? Unfortunately, I didn't have a real answer, and he came up with better, he and 350 came up with better new ones. But I really also fall into what I think a lot of people do, the sense that, oh, if I'm on the front lines and blockading and doing this and that somehow that's the most valuable thing I can do because it's dramatic, it's in your face, etc. And our younger brother, David, since I have some family in the crowd, uncle to some of the people here, brother-in-law to others, I used to say to him years ago, like, David, what's the most useful thing I can do in this issue? And he'd kind of roll his eyes and just be like, just keep writing. And, and there was other reasons I wanted to stop writing books. I produced 25 books so far, 20 of them in this millennium. And so I was averaging about a book a year. And I did actually have a little break, 10 minutes. And, just to sort of look around and exhale and maybe even clean the house up just a little bit and stuff like that. But this is a crucial moment for climate. A lot of exciting stuff is happening. A lot of terrible stuff is happening. We need to build a climate movement more powerful than the fossil fuel industry, which means waking people up, motivating them, equipping them, pulling them out of despair, etc. And it turned out my job for the climate movement was what my job in general has been since 2003 when I wrote Hope in the Dark, which is to, a la Jesse Jackson, keep hope alive, try and inspire, motivate people, or as I used to say in the early days of Hope in the Dark, snatch the teddy bear of despair from the loving arms of the left.
And how do you do that with climate change? I mean, Hope in the Dark started with the concern after the U.S. went to war in Iraq. The thing about climate change, and I write about it from time to time, and I think everyone's wrestled with this, and you've talked about it, it's not an immediate, you can see all these immediate events.
Yeah.
It's not an immediate, tomorrow the bay's going to climb 10 feet, so we better do something today. It's 40 years from now projections show this. Have you found, why is it so important to rise above getting obsessed in scary projections and things and tell the positive story of what we can do now?
It's partly I'm actually kind of a nice person and I don't want people to feel more terrible than they should. But it's also that doomism, despair, defeatism, cynicism all lead to inaction at a time when we need, particularly for those of us with kind of all the opportunities, and I hate the word privileges, but that might be the right word, privileges, all the resources, should be doing everything we can. People don't do things unless they believe it, it's meaningful, it's purposeful, it will have an outcome that matters. And people often go from climate change is real straight to it's inevitable, there's nothing we can do about it, etc. I sometimes call it upper middle class peasant fatalism. Because one thing I've noticed a lot, and I've been to, is Apatisto Encuentro. Our brother David works with the Coalition of Immokalee Workers, who are farm workers, mostly undocumented, who fought all the biggest food companies in the US and won. People on the front lines aren't usually despairing because, if we here in the Bay Area decide there's nothing we can do and give up, mostly it means we stay home and, binge watch whatever and eat junk food or whatever our form of, feeling miserable but having lots of free time looks like. People where it's like, if you give up, you're just accepting that your children will die, you will lose your land, you will be destroyed, you will never escape the gulag. Are often really stubborn, and it's not hope in the sense of feeling good, because hope isn't really a feeling, and it's not even necessarily hope, it's a kind of determination, a refusal to surrender, and you saw it in the Jewish ghettos rising up against the Nazis. You're seeing it in various forms in Palestine now. You see it with indigenous people who didn't give up for half a millennium and are now reclaiming right here in Berkeley and the Bay Area land, culture, etc. So it's really, how do I get, how do you motivate people? And part of it is telling, part of it I think is the facts about climate are we're in a dire situation, but the difference between the best case scenario and the worst case scenario is profound. And we're told in 2018 we had 12 years. Now we have half of them left to try and get it right before 2030, although the natural world keeps changing. Whether that's accurate, we'll know in 2030. So, so the difference, so what we do now matters tremendously for us right now, for the world in 10 years, in 20 years, in 50 years, in 5,000 years. But also people, what I hear from people a lot is a lot of, and I think it's really promulgated by mainstream media and sort of dominant culture, really disempowering stories about the nature of power and the nature of change. I see people who think if you have a protest today and the government or the fossil fuel industry doesn't fall on its knees, admit they were wrong, give you everything you asked for the next day, that you've lost. And of course, change works often in indirect, protracted, complex, unpredictable ways. I also see stories about power that assume that power lies in the hands of a few and all you can do is sort of flatter and beg them to give you what you need. And just generally, I feel, and this is what Thelma and I tried to do with everything we've done with Not Too Late, give people better equipment for recognizing their own capacity to participate and that there's something that makes it worth doing.
So how did you reach out to dozens of authors? Were these kind of tapping into things that were already being written, or did you just say, we have a moment to pull together a totally new anthology on what the world can do about climate change in terms of people getting down and just really wrestling at their scale? I mean, these are a lot of people to reach out to. So the community was already established, I would think.
For the most part, we did reach out to new people we'd never talked to, including the climate scientists, Ed Carr, Joel Gerges, and I forget who our third major climate scientist
And they stepped
is.
right forward.
Yeah.
I mean, they've got the pieces in the book.
Yeah, and but Thelma, it was actually really great. So there was this Adam Hochschild, also part of the journalism school, had this dinner party because I wanted everyone to meet Saket Soni, actually a remarkable climate and labor organizer, and that's where they told me, I was like, I've stopped writing books, and they're like, but I'm doing this project, and they're like, it needs to be a book, and it's kind of like, hey, do what you like doing, and I'm like, well, okay, and and Thelma's on Fiji time. I call her the girl from tomorrow because it's 19 hours ahead of us, and on the other side, I think that's how we count it. It's on the other side of the international date line too. So Thelma gave her thumbs up for a book. That night, I reached out to our amazing publisher at Haymarket, and by 10 a.m. I could tell the dinner party gang that it was going to be a book the next day.
That's a nice turnaround.
And that we would do it within a year. And Thelma came and stayed with me for a completely wonderful week, and she's a real organizer. We took a big piece of foam core, because I'm still have one foot in the art world, which she used as a whiteboard because she's an organizer. And we used lots of Post-its since it wasn't a real whiteboard, figured out what are the things we feel we need to cover. Because what we wanted to create was a book that was a good introduction. We felt there's no book that's an encouraging, broad introduction to climate. Because climate is about colonialism, politics, culture, but it's also about science, but it's also about kind of spiritual and inner life, but it's also about a ton of different things. So we figured out what were the things we needed to cover, and then we basically figured out what was our dream team, the people we most wanted to do this, and every single person said yes. And some people like Adrienne Marie Brown and Antonia Juhas said we're super busy, but we just did interviews with them. Ed Carr, we reused something he wrote. Farhana Sultana had written Also was in the middle of family emergencies and being a tenured professor of climate science, or actually, environmental studies. I forget what her exact field is. It's in the bio. And, but she's a climate person. And, but she had this academic piece, and she didn't have a lot of time, so I used to be a copy editor, and I kind of loved doing it. So I took her 8,000 word plus like 4,000 words of footnotes piece and broke it down into like a 3,000 word piece for her to approve and polish and refine.
That's the good writer. You can read another writer and just say, it can go, it can go, it can go.
But it's also, this is great, we need to keep this, we need to keep this, we need to.
That's a better way to package it.
Yeah, yeah. And so it was really amazing because we really did gather all these people, and making books is really fun. And I did the climate, like there's I think 8 pages called An Extremely Incomplete List of Climate Victories. Because one of the things I think that feeds despair is amnesia. People don't remember how different the world was. There was no climate movement to speak of 25 or 30 years ago, or there was a very tiny one. There were plenty of people fighting the fossil fuel industry in the environmental movement, and also addressing their brutalities around the various wars in Iraq and Kuwait, et cetera. And what is that? What? Okay, I'll just keep talking. So, but where was I? That is a very strange
You were
noise. So,
what you were
yeah.
talking about was kind of
But-
this people fighting all these other
Yeah,
issues,
so we-
and then there's this
Yeah.
issue.
So amnesia. So I did the list, the extremely incomplete list of victories, because people truly don't know. You know, they really forget things. They forget that we actually, solar and wind were these very expensive primitive technologies in the year 2000. We literally didn't have an alternative to fossil fuels 25 years ago. Now, solar and wind are cheaper than fossil fuel and have none of the drawbacks, including both geopolitics and climate stuff, and the air pollution that's giving kids in Richmond asthma and other respiratory things, killing 9 million people a year.
You pointed out in here that you look at some really red states in the Midwest, the mountain
Yeah.
states that get most of their energy from solar and wind.
Yeah, and the really interesting thing I haven't seen anybody say exactly is, if there were no climate crisis, electric cars are still a much better way to do cars. Heat pumps are a much better way to do heat. Solar and wind are a much better way to produce electricity than burning fossil fuel. When I moved, I live in a Victorian apartment in San Francisco. When I first moved in, I was like, oh my God, there's still some gas light fixtures. People burn gas for lighting, that's crazy. But, you know, I have a heat pump, but I'm still burning gas for cooking and hot water. And I think when, like, my fabulous nephew, who's 11 and who's here, when he's my age, he'll be like saying to kids who are his age now, like, yeah, we used to pump methane into our houses, even though it's poisonous and explosive and really bad for the climate. Can you believe it? And then he'll cook something delicious on his induction stove, you know, and and fossil fuel is the worst way to, now that we have better ways of doing these things, we're going to look at fossil fuel as the worst way of doing all these things we do. And there's all these extraordinary things that buy everything and convert. Ocean, incredibly polluting industry, 40% of it is just moving fossil fuel around the world, 40% of those ships. If we stop burning fossil fuel, we just have 40% less ship traffic. One of the weirdest is sort of erratically spread across the earth. You know, we have a lot in the US and Canada. Mexico has the Middle East has a whole shit ton, as they say. The North Sea has a bunch, which they are rich enough they should stop doing it. We on that at OCI. But so you also get the totally corrupt geopolitics. You see that Putin invading Ukraine expected that Europe's dependence on his fossil fuel would somehow dissipate, which it didn't. But it's, you know, our own relationship to the Middle East has been corrupted by fossil fuel before we became more or less energy independent. So So if you take away the climate problem, not that we should, you just see that we suddenly have these remarkable new ways of doing things that let us look at how terrible the old ways of doing things are. And I just wrote a book about George Orwell a few years ago, who died of TB, probably exacerbated by the fact that he was a smoker. But he also lived in a place where people were dying of everything in England ran on coal. And the coal was killing the miners, was killing at one point the Great Smog of 1952 killed 7,000 people in London. We don't burn much coal anymore. Even in the last 20 years, we've made an incredible transition away from it. But so I think that, people who are really young today are going to be able to tell, people who are little kids 50 years from now, like, yeah, and it smelled bad and it made people sick and it destroyed the planet, and for a while people didn't know any better way to do stuff, but now we do.
And you talked about and we're going to talk about UC Berkeley later on, but you talked about you did a commencement speech to the UC Graduate School of Journalism in 2016, and you talked about breaking the story, the failure of the media to put things in perspective and to report on the scale and menace of climate change's impact, and on the shrinking option to minimize rather than maximize it. But then you also talk a lot about the good stories that can be told.
Yeah.
It seems like that's one of there's so much good going on, but the problem itself is so vast.
It's vast, but it's not, we have the solutions, we know what to do. At this point, I almost feel like if we didn't have the solutions, then it would, it's like if you're drowning because the ship sank and there's nothing else to do, that's one thing. If you're drowning because you're too dumb to get into lifeboats, that's another thing. And so it's weird because we have the lifeboats, which is how to leave the methane and carbon dioxide causing runaway climate change, to stop producing them. We know how to change urban design, agriculture, protect forests and other living systems that take carbon in, etc. We have, the obstacles are not flaws in human nature, which is a popular theory, and it's not that each of you needs to have a perfect virginal microscopic climate footprint. It's the industry and the vested players who are refusing to go along with the fact that the great majority of people want to see climate action. So I believe I don't minimize the scale of the problem, the seriousness of the problem. But if I lived in a world full of sunny optimists who are all saying it's all going to be fine, I'd be like, no, wait a moment, we've got a problem. But I live in a world mostly of people, and this includes a lot of the mainstream media's bad reporting, all the shit young people pick up off. Actually, there's amazing people. There's a youth, what's her name, Joshi. There's a TikTok person who's, I think, about to graduate from Berkeley, who's an amazing climate communicator. But there's a lot of dreck on social media. There's a lot of misinformation. Because I think there's a kind of defeatist norm, it's too late, there's nothing we can do, nobody cares, we don't know we'll have the solutions. I feel like I'm always working to try and counterbalance that.
To what extent do the activists and people involved in the struggle contribute to it? Like, speaking as a journalist, It's like every week there's another study saying, new projections find boom, and it's pretty much the same projections as the prior week study, but a different group is putting it out this time, and then you see the story. I mean, it can get just kind of overwhelming, and that seems to be the challenge, is to get beyond that.
There are fresh frameworks and truly new data coming out from time to time, but it is interesting because various climate groups, the central problem remains the same in essential nature, although it's evolved. The science has gotten much better and the solutions have gotten much better, and the climate movement organizing has gotten much better. We've accomplished a lot. And here I might add that most people in the climate movement are not, are not despairing. They're, neither are climate scientists. They take this very seriously. They know that we're gambling with the fate of, not the Earth, there's going to be life on Earth in 500 and 5,000 and 50,000 years, but what's optimum for us and a lot of other species, the lovely last 10,000 years we had, we've really screwed up. And not screwing up more than we have to, and even potentially doing drawdown where if we actually go carbon negative and not just carbon neutral, we could reverse a lot of climate change pretty quickly, which scientists only really fully recognized and embraced in the last few years. So there's actually new science out all the time too. But you have to sift through 100 million dense reports to get at, how to translate something for the general public.
And it is tough because a lot of the basic news snippets turn
Yeah.
into projections show that the sea could rise blank and blank.
Yeah, I think, there are great climate journalists out there, and a lot of them are independent doing podcasts. David Roberts, who focuses on energy with Volts, Christiana Figueres, who negotiated the Paris Climate Treaty, has a great podcast. And a lot of, Hannah Ritchie with the world in statistics or something like that. There's a ton of people doing really good work. So a number of scientists like Michael Mann who are great communicators. I feel like a lot of the mainstream news, I'm with The Guardian, which I think is much better, mostly ignores climate and then often plays up kind of dire news and rather than solutions. There's also something I think just inherent to the nature of human attention spans and the nature of the news. The news really likes it, when something sudden and terrible happens overnight, and climate disasters fit that really well, although even some of them, like heat waves, don't really fit our template, but a hurricane, a flood, the fires we've had so intensely in California. Whereas the fact that, solar has been dropping 10% every year for the last 10 years and every year has outstripped the predictions for how cheap and proliferated it would be. Like, there's no one point at which you say, like, oh my God, we've had a solar revolution. It's very incremental. A lot of the good news is really wonky and technical, and one of the things that's weird is that the IRA, the biggest piece of climate legislation maybe ever passed, is so technical and so varied that I don't know everything in it, and very few people really recognize it. So the Biden administration had a huge climate victory, compromised though it was by Joe Manchin, but people don't, and so I feel like we in the journalism space need to figure out better ways to convey to people. I don't know whether we do quarterly reports on how much new renewables has been done, things, how many fossil fuel battles have been won. There's a ton of lawsuits against fossil fuel corporations really beginning to have an impact right now, go to court.
But it seems like there's also a challenge, and this is something I found writing about the necessity of planning for sea level rise in the Bay Area, and just how do 9 counties act together to do the proactive, very complex adaptive work. There's always a bigger story in the moment. Like if you look at right now, all the issues we're talking about, but there's also a presidential race with
which is
conceivably
ultimately about
mammoth stakes.
Yeah.
There are 2 horrible wars going, each of which could turn into larger. I mean, it's tricky. It's such a massive issue and such a defining issue, but telling the story that day becomes, what about all the other stories? And
Yeah.
is that part of what you've been able to do in the books and organizing in groups you've worked on?
People take climate, and one of the myths is that people don't care about climate. Most recent surveys show, and I think this is a real triumph of the climate movement, most people know enough about climate to be concerned and support spending money and making changes to address it. They're mostly not being offered really good stuff in terms of options as voters, they're not being offered a lot of good information on positive ways to change their life beyond the usual kind of, austerity, climate footprint kind of stuff. And I'm not sure they're being offered a good picture of how much we need to defeat the fossil fuel industry in particular. So I think we, and there are good journalists, but I think we need to change the story. And we also need to tie it to all the other stories. And if fossil fuel becomes obsolete, Russia's shit out of luck. And the Putin regime is sidelined because fossil fuel is what they've got. The whole nightmare of geopolitics in the Middle East will change radically because so much authoritarianism and horrible stuff like Saudi Arabia, everybody's tiptoed around them because they want the oil.
They have the tankers.
And the presidential race is partly about climate. Trump promises to pull us out of Paris again, cut off the IRA, and and a drill baby drill for the fossil fuel industry. I think he used Sarah Palin's famous phrase talking about it. The famous bloodbath thing he said last weekend was about, in the middle of incoherent word salad, about the auto industry where he was, he hates electric cars. And there's a weird way in which there's a certain kind of right-wing white male identity that's very invested in red meat and fossil fuel.
And light bulbs. You want bright light bulbs. You don't want LED light bulbs.
But the funny thing is that I hated compact fluorescent light bulbs, and I kind of hated that era where wind and sun weren't really up and running in the way they are now. And we're always just being told we just had to conserve energy. And compact fluorescents, which are full of mercury, if you break them, you have a hazardous waste situation, have been replaced by really good light bulbs that actually work much better because all the electricity is going to light, almost none of it to heat, and the light actually looks really good, unlike compact fluorescents. So and that's part of what's really interesting is people, I'm saying various pieces of what, we do in the book. People think change is going to be kind of linear, that something will get incrementally better or incrementally worse, but essentially all the players are on stage now. And in the age of compact fluorescence, nobody saw that the LED problem was going to be solved and create these really good new solutions. In the age of Priuses, electric cars weren't ready to offer us something even better. And we can't assume that the future will match. Hello, we love you. And we can't assume that magic solutions will come along and we can just wait. We've seen some really bad stuff like nuclear energy pretends that the future will find some wonderful thing to do with nuclear waste so we can keep producing it. But it has been kind of amazing to see. And because I scour climate news every week, I see that people are working on things you're probably following very closely. What if we designed our communities better in ways that would actually be better for us in other ways, the 15-minute city, pedestrian and public transit-oriented urban design? What if we, new ways to make cement, new ways to, do agriculture?
And another challenge is just there's so much, as you're talking about with LEDs, but just the learning process. Like all the marshland restoration going on in the Bay Area, every one of those projects is unique, and each one is trying new things that haven't been tried before, some of which work better than others. It's such a fascinating, gradual story. I'm curious, so you've talked about how you were an environmentalist going back to high school.
I didn't go to high school, and I wasn't really an environmentalist till my 20s. But
thanks for the correction.
But
I'm really proud
of not going to high school. Had to get that in.
That's fair. But how did you move to this centrality, to the climate being the centrality of your writing? Because you've done so many interesting things, very urgent things, very reflective, scholarly things. How did you get to where you've been for the last decade or so?
And really, at some point in my 20s, I just felt that, there's a famous Earth First bumper sticker, there are no jobs on a dead planet, that the environment underpins everything, that human rights issues, et cetera, you know, what are human rights in the Philippines, if at all, or whatever, in a place that goes underwater. And you know, I grew up in the Bay Area, loving the natural world, et cetera. It made sense to try and do something for it and with it. But I also intellectually got, you know, was in love with the natural world as a kid, and then kind of escaped to cities when I was young. And then sometime in my mid-20s, kind of fell in love with it or returned to that first love, but really wanted to understand it intellectually. So I started working with visual artists, doing environmental art, making landscape photography, thinking deeply about nature and place and our relationship to it, our imagination of it. And I started volunteering at Earth Island Institute at this really extraordinary moment when the rainforest activists at what was then Rainforest Action Network, a very small project at, God, what was the umbrella project called that they're all under? What? No, not the Tides. It was all those places on Broadway at Earth Island Institute. Yeah, so I volunteered at Rainforest Action Network and was around people at EPICA, the environmental project on Central America. And white Americans, thanks to John Muir and the very complex history of the Sierra Club, which I could talk to you for several hours about, but that's not what we're doing tonight, really decided to protect nature by pretending it was virgin wilderness, a place where man is only a visitor, wrote Native people out of the picture. And something so interesting was happening at these two projects of Earth Island, which is when you deal with the tropical rainforest, you cannot pretend that they are uninhabited and people don't belong there. You shouldn't have pretended that with Yosemite, Yellowstone, Death Valley, and all these other places that were indigenous homelands, as the whole North and South American continents were. And so it was really intellectually exciting. My book, Savage Dreams, which is about the nuclear wars that weren't supposed to have started and the Indian wars that were supposed to be long over, happening simultaneously, but in ways people weren't really attending to, really came partly out of that discovery and doing work as an anti-nuclear activist at the Nevada test site and then joining the Western Shoshone Land Rights Project. But I have to admit, I was for a long time. Climate is very important, and so is this other thing I'm working on. And then finally, it just felt like climate is, you know, like I will never stop doing feminism. I don't know if you do feminism. I write about it. And I shake my fist at patriarchy. But, you know, there's other things that I'll never stop caring about, but it just felt like climate was urgent and I'd been kind of hanging around it, and that I needed to find better ways to work for it. Joining all these boards was one way. I donate, most of the donations I make every year are to climate groups, and figuring out how to write about it. Feminism for me is a very easy subject. It's like, you know, I mostly have written about violence against women, and the harm done to bodies like mine is not hard for me to understand, relate to, and write about in ways that people understand and relate to. Talking about the composition of the upper atmosphere, waving graphs. You know, I have spent so much of the last 5 years looking at graphs and statistics and things, and I'm so not that kind of nerd. And so, like, just finding a way and climate is a hard thing to communicate about. I heard a scientist on a radio program 15 or 20 years ago say, if you wanted to create, and you've been pointing this out, a uniquely difficult project, it would, you know, a uniquely difficult thing to get people engaged with. It would be this thing that's like everywhere on Earth, but it's slow, it's invisible, it's incremental, it has many causes and many solutions, not one cause and one solution, like, you know, like saving the bison or something, or saving polar bears might. And yet we've done it. But it is always hard to find ways to get people to really take in the information they need and be motivated. Hard, but difficult is not impossible. And I think the climate movement has done a remarkable job, because people's relationship to climate is radically different, more informed, more urgent than it was even 5 years ago, let alone 10 or 15 years ago.
And how would you, to journalists in the crowd, at graduate school level, practicing, how would you, a lot of what you've talked about is the large-scale resistance to things, but then there's also the restorative aspect. There's, as you said, the scientific, just learning to make a better light bulb aspect. What would the stories be you'd suggest to people living and working in the Bay Area?
Everything is a climate story. There's a gender and climate story. There's many race and climate stories, indigeneity and climate stories, economics and climate stories, local politics. One of the really remarkable things that happened in Berkeley is that one city councilwoman introduced a resolution to ban gas hookups to new construction, which actually got overturned by the courts later. And I use this as an example in the Not Too Late book because it would be really, I can imagine people sitting in Iowa or Florida or whatever saying Berkeley, whatever. How many of you live in Berkeley? You know, a certain amount of Berkeley, whatever gets said about you in other parts of the world. But it became a template, 50 California municipalities, and then, including LA, New York City, almost New York State, a number of foreign municipalities, et cetera, followed Berkeley's example. And so there's also, I think, following a story like that, one of the things that I find difficult, yes, we need newspapers that tell us what happened yesterday, but a lot of what makes people really understand a story is to follow the whole trajectory. How does, this town in Maine banning new gas hookups or wherever go all the way back to one woman deciding to introduce one policy into, I don't know if Berkeley's a small city or a big town, but in one place. And one thing that I think is a place where people get disempowered is that the very end of a process of change is usually a powerful person who appears to be handing something down, whether it's marriage equality or the Inflation Reduction Act. And there's a wonderful movie, should be shown in lots of university programs, called To the End, that goes from the founding of the Sunrise Movement in 2018 to the introduction of the Green New Deal, which, even though it didn't pass, radically changed the conversation about what was reasonable and possible. And it broke the old idea that it was jobs versus the environment. Taking care of the climate is a jobs program. And that's for those of us who've been in the environmental movement, that's such a transformation. And then it becomes part of Biden's platform when he runs for president in 2020. And then it becomes the really good Build Back Better thing, which Joe Manchin and that really annoying senator and Kristen Sinema prevented from passing. But it does pass actually when we'd all kind of given up on it in August of 2022, thanks to my friend Leah Stokes and other people who didn't give up. And so at the end you can say, 50 senators gave us the IRA, but it was actually all these young people who founded a movement 4 years earlier. And, and so also I think recounting the long story, where did this start? And change usually starts in the margins and the shadows. Sometimes people become really famous in the course of doing it. A lot of times nobody's ever heard of them, but this is where the change began. So I feel like changing what stories we tell, how we tell the stories, and if you're a journalist, whatever your beat is, and you know this as an urbanist, it's also a climate beat, and food is a climate story. Everything is a climate story now.
And so where does the story get told? And we've both watched, we both use the term mainstream media.
Yeah.
The mainstream media itself is so different from what it was, and so many people seek out the news they want to hear wherever they are on the spectrum. How do we tell stories that penetrate, that catch the attention of people who may not be looking for that?
I'm not sure I have a good solution to that. And I get a lot of my news off social media, which might make me sound like one of America's losers. but I'm following like the top climate scientists and top climate journalists on Twitter, which I will call Twitter until, forever. And, maybe that annoying guy will give up and find another hobby. And, I think we're all climate communicators. And we did Not Too Late, and then I realized it gave people a lot of the information we thought we had to engage them with climate, but it didn't actually tell them what they could do. So you can find pinned to my Twitter profile and on the Not Too Late and Haymarket websites for the book, I wrote an extra chapter that'll be in the next edition and is in the digital edition. That's basically what I can do. What can I do?
It's a really nice, clean presentation.
Thank
Very
you.
succinct.
Thank you. It was fun doing something that, compared to all my polemical, fancy stuff, was just a really straightforward. I want it to be accessible to a very moderate person in the Midwest, a young person in high school, not just to. But I also think we're all climate communicators, becoming informed, talking about it. I find that a lot of people either lack information or have picked up misinformation. So I think we're all, there's a way in which, yes, we need the media, whatever that is at this point, since we're all anybody who's on social media is kind of the media too. If you're on social media, share good climate stories that are victories, that tell something important, that give people perspective and equipment, etc. And so I think that's part of it too. Because there's also something like, I spend a lot of time around, not journalists, but artists and writers, and there's often this sense that you must do it through your art and writing. And a lot of times we don't need another nice, it's better if this person keeps making their beautiful abstract paintings itself for a lot of money and then donates things and goes to climate meetings and protests separately. It doesn't have to come through the work.
Doesn't have to paint a painting saying gas is bad.
Yeah, but there's often this sense in the arts that anybody doing something creative that's where their political stuff. And sometimes it's incredibly valuable and useful, and it can be really exciting when I will not let you all watch me try and think of a really good example for the next 15 minutes. But, when somebody with a high profile uses it,
Right.
to do something. There's actually, I hung out with Anna Jane Joyner, who's got a project called The Good, which I'm sure Jason knows, The Good Energy Project, which is trying to convince Hollywood to put climate in their films in constructive and useful ways, not just as the apocalypse.
Oh, that's
And they actually have a playbook that talks about different ways to work, write characters, write scripts, take it on.
Oh, that's
And
interesting. Now, the co-sponsor of the talk tonight is the Graduate School of Journalism. And back in 2004, you were interviewed by our book writer at the time, Heidi Benson, and you told her, "I needed a profession and I wanted to learn how to write, so journalism school took care of that for me." And you got your master's at Berkeley. What did you take away from the ivied halls, whether it was Evans Hall or Northgate?
It was Northgate.
Oh,
and,
good for you. I
yeah.
taught Evans, I'm older.
Oh, God. I was kind of a misfit because the school, I think, was much narrower at the time. There was a real sense that everyone should aspire to write for the front page of the New York Times. And I did not. I more or less wanted to be an essayist. I wasn't as political as I am now. That was coming gradually. And I think I was something of a conundrum to them. But the two things that I'm always grateful for is I got taught resourcefulness, how to find out anything, whether you're doing archival work, using public records, interviewing somebody, observing something, and also ethics. I am so old that creative writing programs did not consider nonfiction creative yet, which is one of the many reasons I didn't go to an MFA program. And there are some really good MFA programs and some really good people teaching nonfiction in them, but there are also MFA programs that teach nonfiction as though it's a branch of fiction in which you have your plot and characters already, but you can make shit up. And, you know, and I always used to say to my writing students, and I've taught at, you know, various places, including the J School, where I didn't need to say this, but I'd say it's a slippery slope from the mean thing your stepfather never did to the weapons of mass destruction Saddam Hussein never had. And it's interesting because now I think that we've seen what it's like to live in a regime of lies as the right has become more and more Trumpist. I think people maybe understand more that, you know, you have, and what I feel I got from J School, you have a responsibility to your subject, the reader, and the historical record, you know, and to civil society to be accurate and truthful. And that means you can say, I imagine this happened when you're writing a memoir, or I'm not sure what happened, or I wish it had happened this way, or nobody seems to know, but this person has their version and this person has their version. So, and then also there was a lot of basic nuts and bolts stuff. And I was saying to you, one of the things I loved about it, there's also a sense, I think, if you go to other kinds of writing programs where, you know, you're a very sensitive artiste, journalism is like, nobody's ever like, hey boss, I went to the scene of the murder, I talked to the witnesses, I got the record from the police, but I'm just not really feeling it now. He's gonna say like, have it by, you know, have it for me in 3 hours or you're out of here. You know, you don't get to be that. You really produce.
I edited a small paper in Boston,
Yeah.
A small weekly, and had 2 reporters that I hired.
Yeah.
And one of them turned in this terrible story, and I just read it, and it's like, there's no lead to this. And he goes, well, I couldn't really figure out what the story was about.
Well,
and it was kind of, well, but you do need to. And
I mean, sometimes you need an editor to talk it through with, because I get stumped sometimes. You know, editors sometimes are like, you know, or sometimes you just need to call your friend or your mom or whatever and say, well, I can't write this thing because, and then you talk it out and then you can write it. But
that
yeah.
helps.
So, and I can get where, like, say somebody doesn't know how to write it, but they can't be like, I have writer's block about, you know, the car crash.
He just felt he had done his bit. He had written something, but he didn't care about it. So
Yardage, yeah.
I was just supposed to run it because it was almost deadline. But so what?
Oh, well.
Climate is so central, but then you've done wonderful histories of walking. You've turned stories like New Orleans into ways of looking at how communities form in 1906 in San Francisco. What are the larger stories you hope to tell going forward, as well as doing, you know, kind of climate dispatches like this?
And I usually feel like it's time to write a book when something seems interesting, exciting, and never yet accurately represented. I wrote A Paradise Built in Hell, which you just mentioned, which they have on the table outside, which was about 5 major urban disasters from the 1906 earthquake in San Francisco to Hurricane Katrina, because I'd actually been commissioned to write about the 06 earthquake for the centennial in 2006. And I found all these stories that were full of a kind of extraordinary joy and exhilaration, because everyday life is a kind of disaster of loneliness, separation. People felt a sense of connection, purposefulness, immediacy, solidarity that we don't always feel in everyday life. And often you'd see, oh, this is the San Francisco spirit, oh, this is how Londoners face the Blitz, etc. But you find it over and over. And then Hurricane Katrina happened, because the other thing that happens in disasters is that the authorities feel if they're not in control, things are out of control. And they essentially turn the public, as they did in San Francisco, where they may have killed as many as 500 people, not that there's clear records. In Hurricane Katrina, almost all the deaths were in New Orleans. Some of them were by police and vigilantes. A lot of them were from people who didn't get the help they needed, because the same thing happened. The public was regarded as the enemy that needed to be controlled, contained, suppressed, menaced, shot in the back, rather than, you know, our brothers and sisters who need to be helped. And I wrote that book partly because of Katrina, because I felt that we're entering, even when I wrote that book, which came out in 2009, we were going to enter an age of more disasters and more intense disasters. So it's secretly a climate book. But I also felt, well, just that I felt like it equipped us to be in this disastrous era. But it also told something deeper. And I'm also, like in Wanderlust, etc., and Orwell's Roses, my most recent book before this anthology, I'm interested in kind of the deeper story of who we are, what do we really want, because we're all bombarded by, capitalism and commercial culture telling us we want to own lots of stuff and be very safe and live in private and maybe be incredibly sexy looking and have people admire us. And what you find in disaster is that people deeply yearn for meaning, for membership in something bigger than private life, to be members of, feel like they're part of civil society, of the greater community. We don't necessarily get that. And Orwell's Roses was also, for me, kind of a climate change, like how do you write about anything in the age of climate change? The fact that Orwell was a passionate gardener was interesting to me. Nobody seemed really interested in that. He wrote his biographies and is treated as like, for some reason, but let's talk about the really important things that he's doing. But it felt like, and it's a book that's as much about, it's called Orwell's Roses. It's about the roses he cultivated and the plant kingdom as a kind of major player with agency. But Orwell's own ability to pause from his work as one of the 20th century's great anti-fascists and critics of totalitarianism and propaganda, he paused again and again to pursue pleasure in the natural world, as gardening, wandering around, fishing, etc. And it felt also like this really interesting model of what are we fighting for, what do we need to do the work we're fighting for, etc. So it was really, for me, about there's always kind of a larger thing. Wanderlust, my history of walking, that came out in 2000, was about how embodied we are, how place-based we are, how to think about ourselves in an age where machine travel and, the encroaching world of computers is making us more and more disembodied. What does it mean to be an embodied? How does thinking happen in the mind, but a mind that's in the body that maybe needs to walk, maybe needs to wander to do its thing?
And the way
There's
that
always
being
this kind
on
of-
your own can allow you to clarify and get strength. Or go to Las Vegas.
That was about, erotic walking, political walking, spiritual walking, natural walking in the natural world, creative walking, walking by philosophers, walking by prostitutes, etc. So there always feels like I'm trying to give us better versions of who we are one way or another because, and again, I hope I'm not just a contrarian, but I feel like we get such reduced versions of what it means to be human often. The Paradise Built in Hell, Wanderlust, Orwell's Roses are all about enlarged versions of that. And Orwell's Roses, one of the really exciting things was in my, sort of meandering associative way, I wrote about the phrase bread and roses, which I've known most of my life, but I never fully understood. It came out of the women's suffrage and labor movements in the early 20th century, and the argument was that we need bread, which is what most socialist labor movements fight for, decent income, decent working and living conditions, food, clothing, and shelter, and some rights. But the bread and roses says we fight for bread, but roses too, is an argument that we need pleasure, beauty, culture, nature. We need the freedom to decide what pleasure and beauty and joy are for us. And you often get these kind of authoritarian socialist republics where basically everybody would have the bread, but the state would decide what roses you could have and what you couldn't. So it's also, so looking at these other versions of who we are, who we could be, what we want, these other stories is
That's when you
always
see the
underneath.
need to stretch and go into that exercise.
Yeah.
That's wonderful.
Yeah.
Well, this is great. This is a lot of
Thank
fun,
you.
and there's a lot all sorts of fun things to talk about, but we're going to broaden the audience now, or broaden the number of questioners now and open up to questions from the audience.
Thank you, everybody. Ask me anything.
Okay, so
if people have questions.
so if you raise hands, they will find you.
Give a mic.
There's one.
Yeah, thank you. Can you hear me?
No.
Hello. Well, I'll talk really loud.
Thank you.
It's very interesting to hear what you talked about, but I kind of have a different sort of take that 2024 is a very critical moment. We can either try to push forward to a livable future or we'll fall off a cliff. And one thing that I think is important is that we can get the correct information to the people that matter. And there's some people that are still fence sitters. There's a whole slew. They're never going to listen to what's being said. They're too captivated by this idea that we can go into the past and live the way they were, and they're in their own little bubble. So I'm wondering, what do you think about the idea that maybe what we should really be trying to do is not communicate? I mean, everyone in this room is convinced there's climate change, but we need to get the information somehow through these echo chambers that people are in to the people that will make that little difference and not have us fall off the cliff. I mean, have you put any thought into that?
Are you talking about the election?
Yes, I am definitely.
Yeah, okay. And beyond. And one thing I find a lot is the idea that we need to convert our enemies. I'm not sure quite what your position is, but I think we don't really, and one of the difficult things with climate is that people often feel like they're 5 or 10 years behind. Climate denial is probably going to be, and people on the right would, their houses could go underwater and they'll still deny climate change. We don't need to convert our enemies. We need to motivate and mobilize our friends. Enough people care about climate. But literally, often at events like this, people are like, what can I do? Which is why I just wrote that chapter for the book that's free and downloadable, printable as a brochure, et cetera. That's like, what can I do about climate? And people are waiting to be given, something to do. And the difference between, passivity and action is the difference between winning and losing a lot of the important stuff on something like this. The election's trickier because it's about swing states, and California is a foregone conclusion. Whenever every election night, I sort of talk people off the cliff by saying the great blue whale is coming, which is us in California and our 55 blue electoral votes. But, I go to swing states every 2 years, or to Reno to get out the vote. And, the election will turn on a very small number of people in swing states. So, and it's interesting because a lot of times caring about climate doesn't mean necessarily that you're just going to talk about fossil fuel and renewables and rainforests and oceans and polar ice and stuff like that. You're going to talk about progressive candidates winning elections, and people are going to vote for them because of their policies on abortion or education or housing or prisons or other things as well. And one of the things that's sort of sad and exciting about this country is if we had full, free, fair voting rights, this would be such a much more progressive country. It's very telling that the right decades ago gave up on being a successful majority party and is now a minority party that wants to succeed by suppressing the majority, and even suppressing a lot of votes doesn't work by just stealing elections outright. And it feels like a slow suicide, but they'll do as much damage as they can in the meantime. So yeah, this election matters a lot, but I think it's going to be about motivating the people who agree. And sometimes people get converted. But mostly I see people getting converted from despair to a sense of possibility, from inaction to action, rather than from right to left or something like that.
Rebecca, thank you so much for your splendid talk. I want to keep you on the political question for a moment, because one of the things that many of us, I think, are frustrated by is the invisibility of climate as an election issue. And it seems as though the people who run the political system have decided that the climate is a loser as an issue, so they just don't want to touch it. And candidates are not being required to declare their position on relevant issues related to climate. It's not spoken about, even in the midst of raging wildfires and all the evidence, the mounting evidence. And I wonder, can you talk a little bit about that? Are there things that can be done to compel the electoral system, the political system, to pay attention to climate?
I think that generally each of us has the ability to make climate more visible with whatever platform we have as voters, as people, who have conversations in our workplaces, if we're educators in what we teach. Even if you're teaching English Lit, there's a lot of good climate writing you can use. And to pressure news organizations to focus on climate, go to politicians' events and ask them climate questions. And, so I think absolutely it should be a climate election, and there should be I have not seen a really good story in the major newspapers about here's what the climate future looks like if this guy wins, here's what the climate future looks like if this guy wins. And we know they're really different, but I haven't seen it, and because I'm paying attention, I think, and we think about that, but I think the public needs to understand this will go forward versus this will be killed, depending on who wins the election, that this is a huge climate election. We lost 8 years with George W. We lost 4 years where we went backwards with Trump. And I don't think we can afford to lose these crucial 4 of the 6 years we have left to get it right. And I think change does happen at local, regional, state levels as well, but the national level can even stymie that. California does an amazing job of setting its own climate policies, but the Republican EPA has prevented California, both under Bush and Trump, from implementing those policies. Both Biden and Obama signed those things. Obama came into office in 2008, and like the first or second day, Fran Pavley's emission standards he signed into federal law, and she was a middle school social science teacher, become a California, state rep. So, what else?
Hi, my name is Amber. I'm a sophomore at Berkeley. One of my professors assigned an essay you wrote to our class, so this is really cool. Thank you for being here. So my question is, I guess you talk about this white male personality of this guy who defines himself by fossil fuels and red meat. And then I guess I was also sort of thinking about when you brought up Twitter, I guess another white male personality that's sort of this, I don't know, a tech billionaire, which I don't know if you'd position on the left or the right, but this certain tech billionaire also sort of has a monopoly on electric vehicles. And then when we talk about electric vehicles as a solution and more climate solutions in that area, I think I've been seeing a lot of it being dominated by billionaires, these tech billionaires, and there's also been a lot of environmental justice issues associated with that, with Tesla's factories contributing to environmental injustices in Austin and SpaceX in Boca Chica or whatever. And I guess what are your thoughts on how we as journalists can I guess better interrogate their positions as they're simultaneously sort of working to create climate solutions, but also I guess contributing to environmental harm at the same time?
Oh God. I wrote a long piece that's basically how much I hate Silicon Valley and the billionaires it's produced in the London Review of Books that came out earlier this year. Thank you. Thank you. And I think one of the things you're saying is the focus on electric cars as a solution doesn't address that. A lot of the solution would be getting out of our cars, better urban design, better public transit. I just posted something on Facebook today. They're going to spend $90 million to equip all 700 BART entrances with fare evasion-proof gates, and it's like $90 million. That's a lot of BART fares. And I live near a BART station where I see you have to be pretty athletic to vault the current thing. And I'm just like, hey, these kids are riding BART. That's great. I wrote a piece for The Guardian several years ago where I said, I have an amazing driverless, yacht, plane, car, etc., that if you don't want to drive, take public transit. And the whole driverless car thing, as a San Franciscan, drives me nuts. And it's, and the fact that Silicon Valley can only think of cars as the solutions, although they do periodically decide to invent things like libraries and buses. And, so I think one of the exciting things that doesn't get enough attention is that there's a lot of the way we address the climate crisis is through efficiency, which sounds like austerity, but it just means better design, which could mean more abundance. One of the things Thelma and I talk a lot about is the old narrative around climate is that we need austerity and renunciation. But to live in a world controlled by horrible billionaires, whether it's fossil fuel or tech, is a kind of austerity. To live in a world where 9 million people die from inhaling fossil fuel particulate matter every year is a kind of austerity. To live in a world where so many poor kids in places like Richmond have asthma and other respiratory stuff is, where a lot of young people don't have hope. That's a kind of austerity. We could have an age of abundance if we do what the climate really demands of us. And billionaires are really bad for the climate. They have outsized climate footprints. And there's a few like Tom Steyer who are not terrible people. He has given a lot of money to climate causes. But most of the tech ones, most of the Bay Area ones are turning into full-fledged right-wingers, and often extreme right-wingers like our white supremacist from South Africa, Elon Musk. And extreme wealth is extremely bad for the climate. The top 1% of humanity has a bigger carbon impact than the bottom. I hate the top-bottom things. Let's just say the richest 1% has a bigger impact than the poorest 50%. I often get people with really outdated perspectives claiming that population is the problem, dating back to the Super Racist, published by David Brower, Population Bomb book, which demonized the global South and brown people. But it's not population, it's consumption. The Earth could support 20 billion Bangladeshis or 17 Elon Musks, take your pick. I'm exaggerating slightly, but so I think we need to recognize that billionaires, which have proliferated wildly, partly thanks to deregulation and the skewing of the American economy by Reaganomics and after, and the grotesqueries of the tech industry and its monopolies. We need to talk about billionaires, we need to talk about design, we need to talk about wealth redistribution in relationship to climate. The Guardian just did a good thing on a good issue on billionaires and climate, incidentally. So thank you, because you're right about all of that. Okay,
And
what else?
that's it.
That's it.
Please give another, yeah. I hope everyone enjoyed this event as much as I did, and I hope you'll join us again for an upcoming Berkeley Journalism event. Professor Emeritus Michael Pollan and KQED's Mina Kim will speak in Berkeley Zellerbach Hall Friday, May 3rd, and tickets go on sale April 2nd. Thank you again, Rebecca and John.
too bad. Good to see you. I was so excited to hear what they told me they were starting.